In the stillness of a Virginia night, two officers pulled over a black woman on an empty road, accusing her of a crime she didn't commit. What should have been a routine traffic stop quickly spiraled into something far more sinister, a carefully orchestrated setup. But there was one thing these officers hadn't accounted for: their target wasn't just any woman. Talia Porter was a CIA operative. As she brought her sleek black SUV to a smooth stop, she glanced at her watch, just past midnight. The night had been quiet, the streets lined with flickering streetlights and the occasional passing car. She had nearly completed her assignment in this sleepy town, and within days, she would be gone. Then came the flash of red and blue in her rearview mirror. She didn't panic. She had been trained for moments like this. Keeping her movements deliberate, she eased to the side of the road, turned off the engine, and retrieved her license and registration. A tall officer with a square jaw, Officer Daniel Reese, approached first, his partner, a stockier man named Eric Lawson, close behind. Their badges gleamed under the streetlights as Reese leaned down and shined his flashlight into her window. "Evening, ma'am," he said, his tone firm but practiced. "You know why I pulled you over?" Talia met his gaze with measured calm. "No, officer. I wasn't speeding, and I made a full stop at the intersection." Reese's lips curled into a smirk. "Actually, you ran that stop sign back there. That's a moving violation." She held back a sigh. She knew she had stopped. "License and registration," he demanded, cutting her off before she could respond. She handed over the documents, her movements slow, precise. Reese studied them, lingering over her ID. "You live around here?" he asked. "Yes, officer," she replied evenly. Before he could respond, Lawson's voice cut through the night. "Hey, Reese. You might want to take a look at this." Talia's pulse remained steady, but she watched through the side mirror as the two officers exchanged glances near her trunk. Reese returned, his expression suddenly grim. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." Talia tilted her head slightly. "May I ask why?" "We have reason to believe you're in possession of illegal substances." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Illegal substances? We'll see about that." Suppressing a sigh, she stepped out of the SUV, keeping her movements controlled. Lawson theatrically popped open her trunk, gesturing to a small, unmarked bag sitting near the edge. Well, he said with mock surprise. "Look what we've got here." Talia's eyes flicked to the bag. It hadn't been there when she left her house. She was certain of that. This was a setup. Reese smirked. "Anything you want to tell us, ma'am?" Talia's lips curled into the faintest smile. "I'll save my comments for the appropriate setting." His smirk widened. "Oh, you'll have your chance." As Lawson cuffed her wrists, she barely reacted. "You're making a mistake," she said softly. Lawson chuckled. "Yeah. We'll see." As they drove her to the station, Reese glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "You don't seem too worried," he remarked, his voice laced with amusement. Talia met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Should I be?" Reese scoffed. "You're either brave or stupid, lady. Tough act never lasts long in a holding cell." Talia didn't respond. She knew men like Reese, men who thrived on power, who twisted the system to their advantage, who walked away without consequence. For now, she let him believe he was in control. But that illusion wouldn't last. Except Talia Porter and the two men who had orchestrated her arrest, for Reese and Lawson, today felt like a victory lap. Talia sat motionless in her holding cell, her posture as composed as ever. Through the bars, she could see the edges of the station's activity, the occasional passing shadow, snippets of conversation, but she remained focused. She knew how to blend into the background when necessary, to make herself invisible until the exact moment when visibility mattered most. Her signal had been sent hours ago, and she trusted her team implicitly. But she also knew they wouldn't act immediately. Timing was critical. In the meantime, she needed to sow the seeds of doubt. At the front desk, Officer Jaden's eyes darted toward the holding cell monitors again. Talia hadn't moved much since her arrival, but something about her demeanor gnawed at him. It wasn't fear or defiance, two emotions he was accustomed to seeing in detainees. It was patience. A quiet confidence that seemed misplaced for someone accused of trafficking drugs. Unable to shake his unease, Jaden pulled up her file on his computer. Her driver's license information and address were straightforward, but there was an unusual gap in her employment history. The system flagged her most recent job as independent consultant, with no further details. Frowning, Jaden minimized the file and glanced toward the break room, where Reese and Lawson were laughing over donuts. Their carefree demeanor made his stomach churn. Against his better judgment, Jaden decided to take a closer look at the arrest report. Clicking through the digital records, he scanned the narrative provided by Reese and Lawson. Stopped for failure to yield at a marked intersection, Jaden muttered under his breath, reading aloud. Driver exhibited nervous behavior during questioning. Consent to search granted. Controlled substances found in the trunk of the vehicle. Something didn't add up. He'd been trained to recognize patterns of deception, and while the report followed procedure on the surface, it felt too tidy. Too scripted. Jaden's internal conflict grew as the hours passed. He found himself pacing near the holding cells, glancing toward Talia's cell with increasing frequency. Finally, he worked up the courage to speak. "Miss Porter," he said, stopping just outside the bars. Talia looked up, her dark eyes sharp and assessing. "Yes." Jaden hesitated, his hand resting on his belt. I just wanted to ask, did you really consent to the search of your car?" Talia tilted her head slightly, studying him. She could see the doubt in his eyes, the faint cracks in his resolve. "What do you think, Officer Jaden?" she asked, her tone calm but pointed. Jaden swallowed hard. I'm just doing my job," he said, his voice faltering. "That's what they're counting on," Talia replied, her gaze steady. "Men like Reese and Lawson rely on people like you to look the other way." Jaden's face flushed, and he stepped back, stammering something unintelligible before retreating down the hall. But Talia saw the hesitation in his steps, the conflict etched into his features. The seed had been planted. Meanwhile, in the heart of Arlington, a plain black sedan rolled to a stop outside a nondescript building. Inside, a man in a tailored suit stepped out, his movements deliberate. He was flanked by two other agents, their demeanor professional and alert. "ETA on extraction," one of the agents asked as they entered the building. The man checked his watch, his expression unreadable. "We'll proceed when she gives the signal. For now, we watch." Inside a secure operations room, live feeds from the police station flickered across several monitors. One screen showed Talia in her cell, sitting perfectly still. Another displayed the front desk, where Jaden was visibly agitated, pacing back and forth. "Looks like the kid's starting to crack," one agent observed. "Good," the man replied. "We'll use it when the time comes." In the break room, Reese leaned back in his chair, sipping his third cup of coffee. "You see Jaden earlier," he said to Lawson. "Kid looked like he'd seen a ghost." Lawson smirked, shaking his head. "Probably overthinking things. Fresh out of the academy, they always get jumpy around the first big case." "Yeah, well, let's hope he doesn't start asking too many questions," Reese said, his tone darkening. Lawson shrugged. "Doesn't matter. The evidence is all there, and she's got no alibi. Even if he gets nosy, there's nothing he can prove." Reese nodded, but a faint flicker of unease crossed his face. For the first time, he considered the possibility that Jaden's doubts could be contagious. As the day wore on, the tension in the station began to rise. Talia could feel it, an almost imperceptible shift in the air. She knew her team was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Jaden's footsteps echoed down the hall again, slower this time. He paused outside her cell, his expression conflicted. "You said they're counting on people like me," he said quietly. "What did you mean by that?" Talia's gaze was steady. "You know exactly what I mean," she said. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Jaden stared at her for a long moment before walking away, his shoulders tense. Back in the operations room, the suited man watched Jaden's retreat on the monitor. A faint smile crossed his lips. "He's close," he said. "One more push." One of the agents glanced at him, and the man's smile widened. "Then we turn this whole thing upside down." Jaden sat at his desk, his fingers drumming against the edge as he stared at his monitor. The digital file on Talia Porter remained open, the words blurring as his mind churned. He felt a knot forming in his chest, a sensation that had been growing since the arrest. Something wasn't right, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. He glanced toward the break room, where Reese and Lawson were still laughing, their carefree attitudes grating against his unease. The station felt heavier than usual, the walls pressing in like a silent witness to something unspoken. Jaden's thoughts wandered back to the holding cell. To Talia's words. "That's what they're counting on." Her voice had been calm, deliberate, as if she knew exactly what buttons to press. And maybe she did. But was she wrong? As the hours dragged on, Jaden's doubt turned into quiet resolve. He needed answers, but he couldn't risk drawing attention to himself. His reputation as a rookie already made him a target for teasing. Any signs of insubordination could isolate him further. He waited until Reese and Lawson left the room, then slipped into the records archive. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting long shadows across rows of filing cabinets and computer terminals. Jaden logged into the system, his hands trembling slightly as he searched for past cases tied to Reese and Lawson. Their names popped up repeatedly, attached to arrests that followed a disturbingly similar pattern. Minor traffic violations escalating into drug charges. Most of the defendants were people of color. Most were convicted. The knot in his chest tightened. Back in her cell, Talia remained still, her body a picture of composure. Through the bars, she watched Jaden's shadow move past her cell. His pacing was slower now, his steps more deliberate. He was close, she knew. Close to breaking the cycle of blind loyalty that men like Reese and Lawson relied on. The storm was no longer brewing. It was here. "What's this about?" Reese asked, his voice wary. "Federal investigation," the agent replied, his tone steady and clipped. "We need access to your records and holding cells immediately." Sergeant Bennett hesitated, his brow furrowing as he exchanged a glance with a nearby officer. The FBI's sudden arrival was unusual, disruptive, even, but there was no protocol for outright denial. "Fine," he muttered, gesturing toward the hallway. "Follow me." From his desk, Jaden watched the exchange, his palms slick with sweat. He knew, deep down, that the email he'd sent had triggered this. But he hadn't expected a response so soon, or so public. His gaze flicked toward Reese and Lawson, who stood near the break room door. Their laughter had died, replaced by hushed whispers and furrowed brows. For a split second, Reese's eyes locked onto Jaden's. The rookie quickly looked away, pretending to focus on his screen. The air in the station had shifted, thick with tension, almost suffocating. Agent James White, the lead investigator, stepped into a small, dimly lit interrogation room with his team. A second agent rolled in a cart carrying a portable server and several hard drives. They wasted no time plugging into the station's network, combing through its digital archives. White leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching as lines of code and file names scrolled across the monitor. "Anything?" he asked. The tech agent, a younger woman with sharp eyes, nodded. "Plenty." Their case files are riddled with inconsistencies, repeated arrests, identical narratives, procedural gaps. This isn't just bad policing, it's systemic. White's jaw tightened. Pull everything. I want every record, every report, every piece of evidence tied to those two. In her cell, Talia Porter sat motionless, listening. She could sense the shift, the subtle ripple that signaled her team's presence. The waiting was almost over. She shifted slightly on the bench, her hands resting in her lap. The cuffs from earlier had left faint red marks on her wrists, but she barely noticed. Her focus was on what came next, when the truth would no longer be hidden. In the break room, Lawson paced, his coffee forgotten on the counter. Reese leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching his partner with growing unease. You think this is about her? Lawson stopped pacing. Of course it's about her. Why else would the feds be here? Reese shifted uncomfortably. You think they know? Lawson scoffed, but there was no conviction in his voice. Know what? There's nothing to know. Everything we did was by the book. Yeah, Reese muttered. Sure. Agent White emerged from the interrogation room, flanked by two agents. In his hands, he carried a thick folder filled with printed reports, the weight of evidence tangible. He made his way through the station, his expression unreadable, until his gaze locked onto Reese and Lawson. The two officers froze mid-conversation as the agents moved with purpose, positioning themselves like sentinels around the room. Officers Brandon Reese and Noah Lawson, White said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. We need to speak with you. Reese forced a smirk, stepping forward. What's this about? His tone was casual. We've got nothing to hide. White didn't blink. Good. Then you won't mind answering a few questions. The station fell silent as the agents led Reese and Lawson toward the same interrogation room they had occupied just moments before. From his desk, Jaden watched, his heart pounding. He could see the cracks forming in Reese's confident facade, the tension in Lawson's shoulders. The once untouchable duo now looked like cornered animals. Minutes later, another agent arrived at Talia's cell. The door buzzed open. The agent stepped inside, his expression neutral, his tone respectful. Miss Porter, you're free to go. Talia stood, her movements smooth and deliberate. She met the agent's gaze, nodding slightly as she stepped out. The hallway seemed brighter now, the oppressive weight of the station lifting as she walked toward the front desk. As she passed by Jaden's desk, their eyes met briefly. He opened his mouth, hesitated, then stopped. She turned to face him fully. Thank you, she said quietly, her voice carrying an unspoken understanding. Jaden's chest tightened. He gave a small nod, gripping the edge of his desk. He didn't know what came next, but for the first time since joining the force, he felt like he had done something that mattered. The interrogation room door shut behind Reese and Lawson. Moments later, the sound of raised voices followed. From the station's entrance, Talia watched as the agents methodically dismantled the officers' lies. The storm she had waited for had finally arrived. And it was only the beginning. Inside the cramped interrogation room, Reese and Lawson sat stiffly at the metal table. Agent White stood across from them, his hands resting on a stack of documents. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the faint hum of the overhead light. So, White began, his tone measured. Do you want to start with the arrest report? Or should we jump straight to the planted evidence? Lawson flinched, his eyes darting toward Reese. We don't know what you're talking about, Reese said firmly. His voice carried defiance, but not certainty. White didn't flinch. Instead, he opened the folder and pulled out a series of printed photos. One by one, he slid them across the table, images from the station's security cameras showing Reese and Lawson handling an unmarked bag before Talia's car was searched. Reese's jaw tightened, but he held his composure. That doesn't prove anything, he said. We were securing evidence. White raised an eyebrow. Really? Because these timestamps say otherwise. And we have audio recordings, courtesy of Miss Porter's hidden surveillance device, capturing your little conversation about how easy it would be to frame her. Lawson paled, gripping the edge of the table. You can't use that, he sputtered. That's entrapment, White smirked, shaking his head. No. That's justice. And it's just the tip of the iceberg. He placed another file on the table. We've pulled records from your past arrests, dozens of cases, all with eerily similar patterns. Every single one is under review. But let me make one thing clear, he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You're not walking out of here today. Reese's bravado cracked. His shoulders sagged. Lawson buried his face in his hands. Meanwhile, in the bullpen, Jayden sat at his desk, watching it all unfold. He had been called in earlier to confirm details about the station's processes. Now, for the first time, he felt the weight of Reese and Lawson's stares, the moment they realized someone from within had spoken. As the agents returned to the bullpen, Jayden stood, his hands trembling slightly. He approached Agent White, clearing his throat. What happens now? He asked. White studied him for a moment. Then, his expression softened slightly. Now we clean house. He paused. And you? You did the right thing. Jayden nodded. A small wave of relief washed over him. For the first time since joining the force, he felt a sense of purpose. Talia stood near the station's entrance, watching as Reese and Lawson were led out in handcuffs. The once smug officers now looked defeated, their eyes downcast. The station buzzed with murmurs. Officers exchanged stunned glances as the reality of the situation sank in. Agent Price approached Talia. We've got everything we need. Your work here is done. Talia nodded, unshaken. Good. Make sure it sticks, White smiled faintly. It will. As Talia stepped outside, the crisp air hit her face, carrying with it a sense of finality. Justice had been served. And this was only the beginning. Reese and Lawson sat across from their lawyers, their arrogance now replaced with desperation. The grim reality of their situation was undeniable, the charges against them were overwhelming. Falsifying reports, planting evidence, and abusing their authority in dozens of cases. This is bad, Lawson muttered, his voice unsteady. They've got everything, audio, video, the files. What do we do? Reese, usually the more confident of the two, remained silent, his jaw clenched. Finally, he spoke, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. We fight it. But their lawyers weren't optimistic. The mountain of evidence was insurmountable, and public outrage had already tipped the scales against them. Plea bargains were their only chance of avoiding decades in prison. Back at the Arlington Police Department, the fallout continued. Internal investigations exposed more officers involved in similar misconduct. Resignations poured in as higher-ups scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. The chief of police held a press conference, vowing transparency and reform, but the department's reputation was already in ruins. At the center of it all was Jayden, both praised and ostracized for bringing the corruption to light. Some colleagues avoided him, still loyal to the old ways, while others quietly offered their support. He didn't care. He had done what was right, and that was enough. A week after her release, Talia met Jayden in a quiet diner on the outskirts of town. The atmosphere was calm, a stark contrast to the chaos they had both endured. Jayden sat across from her, fidgeting with his coffee cup. I wasn't sure you'd show up, he admitted, his voice low. Talia raised an eyebrow, a faint smile playing on her lips. You earned this conversation, she said. Not many people would have done what you did. Jayden looked down at the table, conflicted. I couldn't keep looking the other way. But honestly, I don't know if it made a difference. The department's still a mess. And guys like Reese and Lawson, there are more of them out there. It made a difference to the people they hurt, Talia replied firmly. And it made a difference to you. Don't underestimate that. Her words seemed to ease some of his tension, and for the first time, he allowed himself a small smile. What about you? He asked. What happens now? Talia leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. Now, I move on to the next mission. There's always another fight. Months later, Reese and Lawson stood in court, their fates sealed. They pleaded guilty to multiple charges, each receiving a lengthy prison sentence. Their careers were over. Their reputations destroyed. For the first time, they faced the consequences of their actions. Cases built on their lies were overturned, and innocent people were exonerated. Community leaders used the scandal as a catalyst for deeper reform. In a quiet moment, Talia sat in her sparsely furnished apartment, packing a small bag. A dossier lay open on the table, filled with details of her next assignment. She glanced at it briefly before closing it, her mind already on the road ahead. Her phone buzzed. Agent White's voice came through the line. Ready for the next one? Talia smiled faintly. Always. As she stepped out into the crisp evening air, the door clicked shut behind her. The fight wasn't over, not for her, not for the people she worked to protect. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Justice had been served. The truth had prevailed, and that for her was enough.
If you like this story and want to hear more gripping tales like this, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support helps bring these stories to life. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.